A nation is a group of people who feel unified, often by having the same culture, ethnicity, or history. Yet Canada is bound together by civic nationalism because we don't share the same language or culture. So what are some factors that can unify all Canadians? Well, let's start with our geography. We live in the north where it's cold, so we're tough. Well, sort of. The US is our neighbor, which greatly impacts us. In Social 10, you looked at the Americanization of pop culture. That probably has the greatest impact on our identity because they're right next door. And yet, we fight against people labeling us as Americans. We've created institutions that ensure the protection of Canadian culture, like the CRTC. Our geography also relates to the fact that we are ginormous, which can unite us because we like to be the second largest country in the world. But it can also divide us, as the cultural differences between the regions of Canada could be seen as nations within the nation state. We talk of Newfies from the East Coast and the Rednecks of Alberta as separate peoples. Our geography also relates to our resources. The land we live on is rich, rich I tells ya. We have everything we could possibly need. Name it, we've got it. We've got water, forests, minerals, fossil fuels. Okay, we don't have bananas. But this abundance of resources relates to our identity. We are confident and have more than enough to share. It's often when there's a lack of resources that nationalism becomes ultranationalism, with different nations or tribes fighting to ensure that their people will get what they need. But because of our abundance, it can be easier for us to share with other nations within our nation state. Our political power is also a part of our identity. In the internationalism unit, I mentioned that Canada is a middle power. We're not too powerful, but we're also not that weak. Many Canadians apply this to their personal identity, seeing themselves as part of a society that has the responsibility to help out in the world and influence international politics, but that there's also a limit to what we can change. As a whole, we don't seem to encourage really loud protests, but instead the quiet work that comes from being a middle power. Canada has become an urban society that is cosmopolitan. That means that the majority of our people live in cities that are modern. We have a liberal or free value when it comes to a variety of issues, including access to information and the protection of human rights for all people, regardless of gender or race. Cities can also provide greater access to quality education and employment opportunities, depending on where you live in the city. And relating to our multicultural identity is the idea that in cities, you're going to be exposed to so many different cultural groups. The level of racism in a community often decreases when people are able to interact with each other and see each other as human beings, instead of belonging to one nation versus another. Our symbols can also unify us. For centuries, the maple leaf has been used as a symbol of Canada, even though growing up in Alberta meant that the first time I saw large maple trees was when I visited Quebec. We've grown up with the maple leaf flag, but your grandparents might remember the Canadian red ensign. I love seeing the maple leaf on the Canadarm, our contribution to the International Space Station, and most of us recognize this spelling of Canada with the flag attached, which represents our government. We've got the Beaver, Hockey, Tukes, don't forget the RCMP, the Hudson's Bay Company, oldest company in North America. And the Canadian Mint takes into consideration the various ideas of Canadian identity when it creates our currency, helping us to celebrate our identity. We've also created institutions that help to unify us. Art galleries, museums, and recreation centers bring us together to celebrate culture and history. There's award ceremonies like the Junos and the Aboriginal Achievement Awards. The Own the Podium program was created before the Vancouver Olympics and continues to encourage all Canadians to help support our athletes. There's various think tanks like the Dominion Institute or the Fraser Institute that research and discuss issues important to Canadians. We have corporations like the CBC, Air Canada, and Petro-Canada that were initially created by the government to ensure the success of Canadian-owned businesses. Canada's history can also be a unifying factor. Until recently, we'd say that Canada had two founding nations, but we now recognize three founding nations: the English, the French, and Aboriginal groups, who of course have dozens of nations within themselves. But doesn't that then ignore the millions of immigrants who've come to this country and put their imprint on our identity? I want to finish off by talking about a piece of history that's fading, our participation in World War I. I know we looked at World War I in a previous unit, but I didn't spend much time looking at how this event impacted Canada's identity. As was mentioned in the previous video, we had no choice in participating in World War I. After the war, we gained significant steps towards our independence with the Statute of Westminster and our own seat in many international conferences. This was due in part to our ability to show that we were distinct from our British cousins. Canadian troops had less effective weapons and were often under the control of British commanders, yet time and time again we proved our bravery and courage. In the previous video, I mentioned Ypres, Vimy Ridge, and Passchendaele. Another important battle was at Somme in 1916, where British commanders sent Canadian and Newfoundlander troops over the top, only to lose thousands of troops. Some say that lions, our troops, were led by donkeys, the British generals, in this battle. And on July 1st, there are commemorations for the Newfoundlander Regiment that was almost wiped out in this battle. That definitely puts a different spin on July 1st, especially when you consider that Newfoundland didn't join Canada for another 33 years. During the war, there were many sacrifices made on the home front. We made huge financial contributions, but more importantly, we sent over our soldiers. The War Measures Act was brought in, which controlled our industries to make war material, forced citizens to ration our goods, controlled the media, and suspended some basic legal rights, all in the hopes of helping to win the war effort. Canadians were willing to have those controls in their life, as we were all working together to win the war, both in the battlefield and on the home front. The roles of women changed during this time as many women were needed to work in the factories. The women's rights movement was already trying to fight for equality, including the right to vote, and showing that women could do what was traditionally men's work helped to further that cause. Of course, once the war was over, the women were sent home and traditional values reigned for another few decades, until the baby boomers began to demand changes in the 1960s. In addition, so many men were fighting in the war that teenage boys were expected to leave school and work on the farms. And we've already talked about the conscription crisis in a previous video. Today, we look back at the treatment of enemy aliens in internment camps with regret, as well as recognizing the negative treatment for our pacifist nations, such as the Hutterites, Doukhobors, and Mennonites, as being really unfair. All of this, our bravery, our government controls, the treatment of other groups, they're all part of our identity today. World War I was an essential moment in Canadian history. But of course, different groups living in Canada will have different perspectives on what this event means to their individual and collective identity as Canadians. If we come back to all of those factors that can unify us, if we let them, those factors can also divide us. It's up to Canadians to focus on our unity instead of our divisions if we hope to remain a strong nation-state. We can use these factors to support our civic nationalism and become stronger.